Hi, welcome to Not Enough Time. I'm featuring watches I own and love, why I chose them and what other options I considered. If you like this content, really appreciate if you click like and subscribe to this channel. In this video, I'm focusing on Panerai, and I'm going to cover why I chose this, the Panerai Luminor Due or PAM 01249, and how did I go from being curious about Panerai the brand to a big fan of what they do. I'll cover the other options I considered and what I feel are the highlights across their collections. And lastly, I'll end with a brief summary of Panerai the brand and their story to date. Alrighty, back to this, the Panerai Luminor Due. It's described as having an ivory sunbrushed dial, although I'd say that's probably more sunburst champagne or pale gold. It has luminous Arabic numerals and hour markers. They've used overlapping sandwich style discs, so the numerals and markers are essentially stenciled in with yellow luminescent in the lower base, really shining through. And when you look at this dial, it certainly has a lot of depth and layers. Even the hour and minute hands feel a little bit elevated. You've then got this second layer with the stencils, and then you can see underneath the depth with that yellow kind of shining through. This, coupled with the dome sapphire glass, gives it, I think, a really vintage feel by day. By night, this has one of the most striking luminescent dials I've seen. Elsewhere on the dial, you've got the date at 3 o'clock and a small seconds hand at 9 o'clock. It has an automatic movement with a generous 3-day power reserve and is 30 meters water resistant and comes with this alligator black leather strap. The watch is 42 millimeters, around about 49 millimeters lug to lug, but wears very nicely. For context, my wrist is just over 17 centimeters, just over 6.5 inches in diameter. And while 42 millimeters is considered at the larger end of watches, it's certainly at the lower end of Panerai's range of watches, many at 44 or 47 millimeters. But I feel there's a misperception about Panerai in terms of how they actually wear on the wrist. And I think some of that misperception comes from the fact that they look large. But the reason why they look so large is actually that the space is all taken up by the dial. The surrounding case and the lugs are actually very short. And for me, the dial is what draws me to a watch. And having that stand out as much as it does in a Panerai, and having it so large and legible, for me is really a strength. And so I think when you're comparing the size of Panerai with other brands, the analogy I would give is a bit like with flat screen televisions. Suddenly the actual screen diameter became much larger, and yes, televisions as a whole, the trend has been to have them bigger, but equally the actual surrounding bezel has got much smaller, so you maximize the screen size. And I kind of feel that's what you get with a Panerai. You get maximum dial size, and I think I was guilty of this as well. I'd appreciated and knew of Panerai. I'd seen their watches on their websites. I'd been very interested and thought that they look great, they look interesting, and their design is so iconic, it's so unique. I mean, there are not many watch brands where you can just recognize, hey, that's a Panerai from so far away. The design language is very consistent. You could say that perhaps about some Rolex models, some Cartier models, or other iconic watches like the Royal Oak or the Nautilus, but you really need to think of Panerai within that context, because the design of the watch is unmistakably Panerai. And it may not be for everyone, and these are certainly typically relatively larger watches. I think it's a mistake to discount Panerai on the assumption that all of them are too big. And what I found is actually trying them on and connecting with them in person, it really quickly changes that perception. And the case is fairly thin. It's just under 5 millimeters thick, so it wears kind of low slung on the wrist, a bit akin to wearing a Rolex Daytona, which I like. It feels snug. So the story for me was being on a holiday in France, passing a Panerai boutique, looking in the window, seeing the watches actually in the flesh as opposed to on the website, and they looked really nice. My wife actually convinced me to go in the store. I thought, well, I'm not going to buy one, I don't need one. And eternal credit to her for really not only supporting but joining me on my passion and journey through watches. And in this moment, going into a Panerai specific boutique with no other distraction but just purely focused on Panerai, the offerings they have across their collection, the expertise, the depth of knowledge of the staff, their willingness to let me try everything on and experience it on my wrist. That is when it really blew me away. Not only were they much nicer to look at in the flesh, they also just resonated and connected with me so much more deeply than I had imagined. At the end of that, you know, my wife was like, you've got to buy that watch. It's beautiful. And I kind of, yeah, I know. But I said, look, let's take some time. I'll come back later. I'll make a decision by the end of the day. You know, we went away for several hours. It got to the very end of the day, and I'd been mulling over in my mind, you know, can I justify this watch purchase, and do I really need this? But it had really been playing on my mind. I also knew that it was offered slightly more cheaply than I could get it in the UK. Prices were going to go up. You could claim back VAT. So there was a certain reason to accelerate the decision there and then, but I was also just wanting to be clear that I'm really thinking this through. I eventually got back to the boutique with my wife. It was closed. I knocked on a window, just, you know, sadly hoping maybe someone will come and answer, and kindly they did. I persuaded them, look, sorry so late, but I do want to buy it, and the rest is history. And I love a lot of the offerings across Panerai's, each of their collections. I went for the Luminor Due because one is at the slightly smaller end of their scale at 42mm, but actually the 44 and almost borderline 47s do wear very, very well as well. It's slightly thinner. For me, that increases its versatility. You can wear it during the day, you can wear it to work, you can wear it in the evening. It's beautiful outside with the sunburst dial. It captures the light. It really comes into its own. I love that stencil design, which has such vintage charm for me. But in the evening, this watch really comes into its own. It's my favorite watch in the evening. The lume underneath, it just glows in the evening and at night. It's fun. It's fantastic. It's something to behold. And I don't want watches to be less ordinary. I don't want kind of bland watches. I enjoy watches that have a personality, and this for me still has core DNA from Panerai's iconic design. It's just been slimmed down a little bit to increase its versatility. But I don't want to just focus on this watch. I want to provide some context. What were the other watches that I considered? And also, what are the highlights across all of Panerai's collections? And I genuinely feel across all four of Panerai's lines within their collection, there are definitely some interesting and some standout choices. It's actually a difficult decision to make, you know, which Panerai is the one for me. And I also think it's a difficult decision to just land on one. I could honestly see myself over time adding a second. And there is a community of more than 30,000 members across the globe in 30 local hubs, the paneristi, who proudly share their passion and enthusiasm and dedication to Panerai. This isn't part of Panerai, the corporation. This is a self-forming community of shared passion and interests. Alongside Rolex, I cannot think of another watch brand that has generated such fervor. So the other watches that I considered, I looked at others across the Luminor Due collection. This one in particular stood out for me with the blue dial, which is lovely, also in 42mm. I didn't go for it because I have another watch already with a blue dial. But before I got to the Luminor Due collection, I spent most of my time to start with looking at the Luminor Mariner and wider Luminor collection. Standouts for me included these that you'll see in both blue and in green, which I think are lovely. The one I was so tempted with, and it was a standout watch for me, you know, really beautiful, is this equation of time that you'll see here. It's actually in 47mm, so I was debating am I kidding myself? Can I really carry off a watch of that size? And I think, as you'll see here, with my just over 6.5-inch wrist, probably at the lower end wrist size that can support this watch, but it just about worked. And certainly if you have a larger wrist, highly recommend it. But it is certainly a beautiful watch and one that's stuck in my mind. I didn't know this myself before, but the equation of time displayed on the dial is essentially the difference between the mean time and the true time indicated by the solar meridian. Beyond the Luminor range, which to be honest I was most drawn to because it has that iconic crown protection on the side, I did look at the Radomir range, and beautiful watches there too. The two that stood out for me, this one, the California, which I think is a lovely looking watch. Again, larger at 47 millimeters, but certainly, I think very cool. Standout for me personally in the Radomir range is this Bronzo, which I really feel is a beautiful watch. Lastly, I think their submersible range also has some beautiful watches. I mean, there are sports watches and they're sports watches. We seem to use that word today to classify anything that isn't a dress watch. I think if we were to look at a spectrum between day-to-day watches and truly sports watches, which are much more kind of rugged, much more robust and durable, the submersible range I feel is towards the upper end of that spectrum. I don't know if it's for me personally, but I feel if you're looking for a sports watch that's durable and something perhaps with that kind of explorer vibe, for me this is actually a better alternative than Tudor. One of their brand ambassadors is Mike Horn, who became famous 20 odd years ago after completing a 1-year, 6-month solo journey around the equator without any motorized transport. He also did a 3-month solo navigation around the Arctic Circle. So he's become a brand ambassador around some of the watches within the submersible range, and they certainly have that kind of rugged, I feel, kind of true explorer vibe. The standouts for me are Goldtech is very smart. Also, I love the Bronzo Blue Abiso that you see here. There is one part of the Mike Horn edition also that I've put up on the screen here. So lovely watches. I don't know if I would carry them off myself, but I can appreciate them, and I think somebody wants that true sort of rugged sports watch, these should certainly be a consideration. Lastly, and going back to that Tudor comparison, where I see a lot of Tudor watches paired with quite funky straps, and I have nothing whatsoever against Tudor, but I just feel it seems to saturate a lot of coverage. And then I look at things like, for example, this limited edition Lunar Rossa from Panerai, which has a tie-in with the American Cup, and I think, hey, that's again a lovely watch, really nicely styled. But all up, I came back to this one. They're watches that I can think are aesthetically beautiful and I can appreciate, and some of the other watches that I discounted because they didn't necessarily offer something as different and distinct within my collection. So I already have a watch with a blue dial, for example. But watches are personal. You've got to pick something that resonates with you personally, and I think whilst there are many watches I can find that are beautiful, there's the watches that I really find a deep, almost more emotional connection with, that resonates with me, and this certainly is one of those watches. Lastly, I'll just quickly summarize Panerai's heritage and history. So they started back in 1860, where the first shop was built in Florence, and the city's first watchmaking school and the history of Panerai began there in Florence. The Panerai family had been supplying precision instruments to the Italian Royal Navy over a number of years, and that included them starting to innovate and actually build a patent for a radium-based powder to make dials of instruments and sights brighter to help the Italian Royal Navy. And I mentioned earlier with the watch that I own, this sense of these overlapping discs in this sandwich dial. The upper part is anodized aluminium with perforated indexes and numbers, and they work with luminescent materials on the underlayer, and hence the Luminor range was born. The iconic crown protecting device on the right hand side came from building a dive watch for the Egyptian army around about the 1950s. And some of the submersible range comes through from work that Panerai did with the Italian Navy in the Underwater Commandos Division for deep sea diving. And Panerai shifted from being a company that built watches for a purpose for the Navy to one that captured the much wider public imagination when in 1996 Sylvester Stallone wore one in the film Daylight after seeing one in a store and really liking it. He also famously gifted one to his friend and movie star rival Arnold Schwarzenegger, who also brought Panerai to fame, featuring it in the movie Eraser later in the 90s. So Panerai certainly became synonymous with kind of macho, well-built guys who also had larger wrists. And I wouldn't describe that as me, but when you actually try them on, and now they're also offering a broader range of sizes, the reality is the appeal is much broader. I think Panerai have kept their Italian passion and heritage. In 2001 they reopened their boutique in Florence. After being acquired by the Richemont Group, their manufacturing has moved to Switzerland since 2002, so they combine that Swiss watchmaking expertise but keeping their original identity. So all up, I love the iconic design of Panerai. I love the options that they have across their collection. I love the heritage, and I get how this is a watch you can really feel passionate about. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Really appreciate if you can like and subscribe to this channel. Please add your comments, interested to know which Panerais you prefer. And thank you for watching Not Enough Time.